Okay, so welcome to week two's video. This is for business communications too. We'll be talking a little bit about interpersonal skills today, and I'm going to be going over it with a case study. I'm going to walk through all of the slide decks, kind of telling a little bit of a story on what's going on with the lecture. So don't forget, it's week two. There was no week one video. We actually met in class, so that was not a problem. So why don't we just get started? You typically how I start all of my lectures. I'll start off by a reminder of what assessments are due and when. So watch for your screen for that one. So I want to start with a person that you've probably all met in your life. I'm going to call him Mark. Mark was one of the smartest people on a team I'd worked with years ago, and technically he was brilliant. If something broke, he could fix it faster than anyone else. If there was a problem that no one else could solve, Mark could quietly solve it. But people avoided him. Meetings went quiet when he spoke, projects slowed down when he was involved because working with him was exhausting. Mark didn't fail because of intelligence. Mark failed because of communication. Everything in this lecture revolves around understanding why that happens and how emotional intelligence shapes those outcomes. The distinction that we need to establish immediately is that the interpersonal skills are not about being friendly. They're about being safe to work with. Emotional intelligence is what determines whether people feel safe bringing you information or a disagreement or worse, a piece of bad news. So I go back to Mark. He believed that he had strong interpersonal skills because he was honest. What he didn't realize was that honesty without emotional intelligence often feels like aggression. People stopped challenging him, not because they agreed with him, but because it wasn't worth the emotional cost. And this is where emotional intelligence becomes visible. It shows up when things become uncomfortable. Mark would have been confused by research showing that employees rank interpersonal skills as the most important and that recruiters prioritize oral communication and listening. He would have argued that technical competence should be the primary criterion for evaluation. And he's half right. Technical competence is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So, when Mark's manager conducted performance reviews, the feedback was consistent across all multiple colleagues. People acknowledged his technical brilliance, but described him as difficult to work with. His manager tried to explain that strong communication improves performance in relationships, but Mark heard this as people being too sensitive. He believed that if he was technically correct, that should be enough. What he couldn't see was that his technical correctness was becoming operationally irrelevant because people were routing around him, going around him to avoid that emotional cost, as I just mentioned, about engagement. The organization kept Mark employed because, well, frankly, his technical skills were valuable, but they stopped promoting him. They stopped assigning him to client facing projects. They stopped putting him in leadership positions. He interpreted this as the organizational politics or favoritism, never recognizing that his communication style had become a ceiling on his career progression. The research about interpersonal skills predicting success was not about being nice, it was about being effective. Mark's inability to communicate meant his expertise couldn't be deployed at full scale. Mark's interpersonal skills weren't actually skills at all because there were reactions. When someone presented work he disagreed with, his first response was to point out the flaws. When someone asked him a question, his first response was to assess whether the question demonstrated adequate preparation. When someone challenged his approach, his first response was to defend his position. These weren't deliberate communication choices shaped by emotional intelligence. These were automatic responses that Mark had never examined. Interpersonal skills shape daily interactions, but only when they're conscious and adaptive. Mark treated every interaction the same way, regardless of context. He spoke to junior developers the same way he spoke to senior architects. He addressed clients the same way as he addressed internal team members. He responded to good faith questions the same way he responded to obvious errors. This lack of differentiation revealed that emotional intelligence was not underpinning his communication style. Emotional intelligence would have allowed Mark to recognize that different situations require different approaches. A junior developer asking a basic question needs encouragement and context, not a reminder to read documentation. A client expressing concerns needs to be felt heard and understood, not to be told that they're wrong. A colleague proposing an alternative approach needs space to explain their reasoning, not immediate dismissal. And his inability to adapt his communication style to the emotional demands and needs of each situation meant his interpersonal interactions consistently failed to achieve their purpose. Mark understood interpersonal communication as a verbal message exchange. He would say what he meant, and he expected others to understand him. What he missed was that interpersonal communication occurs between two or more people, and meaning is negotiated and interpreted. It's not a one way transmission where the speaker determines the meaning. It's a collaborative process where meaning emerges through interaction. During a project planning meeting, for example, Mark explained his proposed architecture for a new system. He spoke for 20 minutes, providing technical detail and rationale. When he finished, he asked if there were any questions, but no one asked questions. Now, Mark interpreted this as agreement and understanding. He began implementing his architecture immediately. 3 weeks later, the project manager discovered that Mark's architecture was incompatible with constraints the team had discussed in previous meetings. When confronted, Mark said he explained his approach clearly and no one had objected. He was technically correct that he had explained his approach. What he hadn't done was verify that others understood, check whether his approach aligned with the broader project constraints, or create space for meaningful dialogue about alternatives. What he had transmitted was information, but he hadn't negotiated the meaning. The result was 3 weeks of wasted work and significant project delay. This is a core of what interpersonal communication actually means. It's not about clarity of expression alone. It's about creating a shared understanding through iterative exchanges. Mark's communication failed because he treated it as a monologue rather than a dialogue, never recognizing that meaning must be negotiated rather than imposed. Mark genuinely believed that meaning reflected his thoughts and feelings, which is partially correct. Where he went wrong, though, was assuming that if he expressed his thoughts and feelings clearly, meaning would automatically be shared. Communication succeeds when meaning is shared, but sharing means requiring more than clear expression. It requires confirmation that the other person has understood what you have intended, not what you've said. A junior developer named Lisa approached Mark with a question about database indexing. Mark explained that she should create a composite index on the two columns most frequently used in where clauses. If you know SQL databasing, you'll understand. If you don't, it's okay. Now, Lisa nodded and returned to her desk. Mark believed the communication had succeeded because he had clearly explained what to do. Now, 2 days later, Lisa's code failed. It failed in the performance testing, it failed pretty much everywhere. Mark reviewed her implementation and discovered she'd created two separate indexes rather than one composite index. And he was frustrated, telling his manager that Lisa had not followed his clear instructions. But Lisa had not understood what a composite index was. And she had been too intimidated to ask for clarification after Mark's initial explanation seemed to assume what she'd already known. Now, this gap between expressing meaning and sharing meaning hadn't succeeded because meaning was not actually shared. If Mark had asked Lisa to explain back to him what she was going to implement, he would have discovered that the misunderstanding immediately, and he could have created an environment where Lisa had felt safe asking follow-up questions, and then she would have sought clarification. Instead, his communication style created conditions where meaning couldn't be confirmed, which meant meaning couldn't truly be shared. Mark was a bright guy, so he understood encoding. He was actually really skilled at converting his thoughts into technically precise language. Where he and his communication broke down was in recognizing that decoding is equally as important and that his role included helping others decode accurately. Encoding is converting meaning to messages. Decoding is interpreting messages. Errors cause miscommunication. Mark sent an email out to his team that said, "The current implementation is inefficient and needs to be refactored before we can proceed." This was clear encoding. This was clear encoding by Mark in his perspective. He had a specific inefficiency in mind and a specific refactoring approach that would address it. He encoded this meaning in a message and transmitted it. However, here's the big however. 3 team members decoded this message in 3 different ways. One thought Mark was referring to the database queries and began optimizing SQL. Another thought Mark was referring to the API structure and began redesigning endpoints. A third thought Mark was referring to front-end rendering and began implementing lazy loading. All 3 spent 2 days on work that Mark had not intended because they had decoded his message differently than he had encoded it. And when he discovered it, he was frustrated that his team had not understood his clear instruction. But his instruction had not been clear in the sense of enabling accurate decoding. He had basically assumed and shared that context that didn't exist. He had used terms like current implementation without specifying which component. He referenced inefficiency without describing the specific problem. His encoding was precise from his perspective, but ambiguous from his team's perspective. This is where errors cause miscommunication, and Mark's encoding wasn't wrong, but it was incomplete. It failed to account for how others would decode the message. Effective communication requires both careful encoding and verification of accurate decoding. Mark consistently skipped the verification step, which meant miscommunication was systematic rather than occasional. It was there. So he rarely achieved a shared meaning with his colleagues, even though he believed his communication was clear. Shared meaning occurs when understanding aligns, but barriers often interfere with it. The barriers in Mark's communication weren't primarily about technical complexity or language precision. They were actually about the emotional and relational conditions necessary for alignment to occur. During a code review, Mark identified a security vulnerability in a colleague's implementation. He wrote a comment that said, "This is a critical security flaw. We cannot deploy code with this level of risk." His meaning was clear to him. There was a SQL injection vulnerability that needed to be fixed before the deployment. His colleague James decoded the message as a personal attack. James read Mark's comment as implying he was careless or not competent. And the alignment of understanding broke down not because James misunderstood the technical issue, but because the emotional tone of Mark's message created defensiveness that interfered with the rational processing of the technical content. So James fixed the vulnerability, but avoided working with Mark on future projects. The technical meaning had been shared successfully, but the relational damage meant that future opportunities for shared meaning were now compromised. This is the barrier that Mark never recognized. His focus on technical precision meant he ignored the emotional conditions that enable or prevent alignment of understanding. Shared meaning requires not just accurate transmission of the content, but also creation of conditions where another person can receive and process the content without defensiveness or emotional interference. Mark's communication style consistently created barriers that prevented this, which meant shared meaning remained elusive, even when his technical explanations were actually accurate. Mark also understood physical noise. He knew that a loud environment or poor audio quality could interfere with the message transmission. What he failed to understand was that noise in communication extends far beyond physical distortion. Noise is any distortion or interruption of messages. And in Mark's case, the primary noise source was the emotional reaction his communication style generated. During a video conference with a client, the audio connection was poor and several participants had to rejoin to connect. Mark became visibly frustrated, commenting that the client should have tested their connection before the meeting. This created immediate psychological noise. The client became defensive and less receptive to the technical recommendations Mark was presenting. Even after the audio quality was improved, the client remained guarded in their responses, and Mark's technical explanation of why a particular feature would be difficult to implement was decoded as Mark being dismissive of their needs rather than as honest technical assessment. That noise that Mark had first introduced through his earlier comment about their connection continued to distort the communication well beyond that physical audio problem once it's been resolved. I tell this story because it illustrates that noise operates at multiple levels simultaneously. There's physical noise in the audio connection. There was psychological noise created by Mark's response to the technical problems. There was semantic noise because the client began interpreting Mark's technical language through a lens of defensiveness rather than through collaboration. All of these forms of noise interacted with each other to create a communication environment where shared meaning became next to impossible. Mark left the meeting believing he had communicated clearly about the technical constraints. The client left the meeting believing that Mark was difficult to work with and began looking for a different vendor. Both of these interpretations were consequences of noise, but Mark only recognized that physical audio problem and never understood how his own communication style had generated far more significant interference. Because of who he was, Mark encountered all four types of noise regularly, but he only acknowledged physical noise as real. Physical noise, like background sound, poor connections was obvious to him, but physiological noise like hunger, fatigue, he dismissed as irrelevant to professional communication. Semantic noise caused by different interpretations of words he's attributed to others as not being precise enough. Psychological noise created emotions or attitudes that he blamed on others for being too sensitive. During a late afternoon meeting, Mark presented a complex technical proposal to stakeholders who had been in meetings since 8 in that morning. They were expressing physiological noise in the form of mental fatigue and low blood sugar. Mark's presentation was dense with technical detail and required sustained concentration to follow it. Several of the stakeholders began checking their phones or losing focus. He interpreted this as disrespect or a lack of interest rather than recognizing the physiological noise interfering with their ability to process that information. He responded by adding even more technical detail, believing that more thorough explanations would recapture their attention. This actually increased the cognitive load when participants were least able to manage it, which meant his communication became less effective even as he invested more effort. So after the meeting, he used terminology in follow up emails that created a semantic noise. He referred to edge cases and race conditions without defining these terms for a non technical audience. Different stakeholders interpreted these phrases differently, creating inconsistent understanding of what Mark was proposing. The psychological noise was the most significant. His earlier comment to one stakeholder that this should be obvious to anyone with basic technical literacy created an emotional barrier. That stakeholder stopped asking questions and began agreeing with everything Mark said to avoid appearing technically illiterate. Now, Mark interpreted this as agreement, as and understanding, and moved forward with implementation, only to discover later that that stakeholder had completely different expectations for the project. So all four types of noise were present and interacting, but Mark only recognized the physical noise as the real barrier of communication. This meant he couldn't address the more significant sources of interference that were actually preventing shared meaning. Try as he could, he never understood the past experiences shape interpretation. He assumed that if he explained something clearly, everyone understood it in the same way. He failed to recognize that shared experience improves understanding precisely, but it creates a common filter through which these messages are interpreted. Mark came from a computer science background, pretty obvious, where direct criticism of technical work was normalized, and in fact, it was even valued. In his undergraduate program and early in his career, people had routinely told him his code was inefficient or his architecture was flawed. He had learned to hear this as useful feedback rather than a personal attack. This lifetime experience created a filter through which he interpreted and delivered technical criticism. His colleague Sarah came from a design background where critique was framed differently. In design education and practice, feedback typically starts with identifying strengths, then explores opportunities for improvement, and frames suggestions as possibilities rather than corrections. So, Sarah's lifetime experiences created a filter where Mark's direct statements like "this approach is wrong" felt aggressive or dismissive rather than helpful. When Mark reviewed Sarah's front end implementation and told her bluntly that her component architecture was poorly structured, he believed he was giving her the same kind of useful technical feedback that he had always valued. Sarah had decoded this through her filter of lifetime experiences and heard it as Mark saying she was incompetent. She became defensive, stopped listening to his technical points, and began avoiding him. Mark never recognized that they were using the same words, but experiencing entirely different communication because their filters of lifetime experience were translating those words differently. He believed the problem was Sarah being too sensitive. Sarah believed the problem was Mark being unnecessarily harsh. Both were wrong. The actual problem was that neither recognized how their different filters were creating different meanings from the same message. Shared experience improves understanding because it aligns filters. When Mark communicated with other computer science graduates who shared his educational background and professional experiences, communication was smoother. They shared filters that allowed his direct criticism to be decoded as he intended. When he communicated with people from different backgrounds, his failure to adjust for different filters meant consistent miscommunication. I think it's obvious to say Mark had a high IQ, but a very low EQ, emotional quotient. He understood complex technical systems, but didn't understand or manage emotions effectively. Emotional intelligence means understanding and managing emotions, supporting empathy, and predicting performance. Mark's lack of emotional intelligence meant that despite his technical brilliance, he was consistently underperformed relative to his capabilities. So, a project that Mark had led experienced unexpected delays when a critical dependency was not delivered on time by another team. Mark's immediate emotional response was anger and frustration, and he sent an email to the other team leader that said, "Your team's failure to deliver on schedule has jeopardized our entire project timeline. This is unacceptable." Now, this response demonstrated a very low emotional intelligence across multiple dimensions. Mark didn't understand that his own emotions, he didn't understand them well enough to recognize that his anger was driven partly by fear of how the delay would reflect on his leadership. He didn't manage his emotions, allowing his anger to drive his immediate response without considering those consequences. He showed no empathy for other team situations or constraints. His communication predicted negative performance outcomes by damaging those relationships that the project depended on. A colleague with higher emotional intelligence in the same situation may have recognized their own frustration, taken the time to manage that emotion before responding, considered what the challenges that the other team might be facing, and crafted a message that maybe acknowledged the problem while preserving that relationship. Something like, "I know your team has been dealing with an unexpected challenge. The delay in the dependency is creating a timeline pressure on our end. Can we schedule a call to discuss options for getting back on track?" Now, both messages that I've talked about communicate the same factual problem, but the emotional intelligence in the second message creates conditions for collaborative problem solving rather than a defensive conflict. Mark's low emotional intelligence meant his communication consistently made problems worse rather than better. His technical assessment of situations was usually accurate, but his inability to understand and manage those emotions meant that accuracy couldn't translate into effective action. This is why emotional intelligence predicts performance. Technical skills determine what you can do in isolation. Emotional intelligence determines what you can accomplish through collaboration with others. What Mark experienced was emotional hijacking. He experienced it frequently. And though he would have denied it, he did. Emotional hijacking occurs when emotions override that logic and lead to an impulsive reaction. Mark believed he was always logical and rational, but his emotional reactions consistently interfered with his ability to think clearly in challenging interpersonal situations. During a design meeting, a junior designer suggested an approach to an information architecture that Mark immediately recognized as problematic. He felt a surge of frustration, thinking, well, how can they not see the obvious problem with this? This emotional reaction hijacked his cognitive processing. Instead of taking a moment to consider why the junior designer might have proposed this approach or what valid insights might be embedded in the suggestion, Mark responded impulsively. He said, "That'll never work. Anyone with experience in information architecture would know that approach creates more problems than it solves." And as a result, predictably, that junior designer shut down immediately, and the rest of the meeting proceeded in uncomfortable silence. Mark believed he had efficiently addressed a bad idea. What actually happened was his emotional hijacking prevented him from engaging productively with a colleague's contribution. So later that day, Mark's manager asked him about the meeting. As Mark explained what had to happen, he felt another surge of emotion, this time defensiveness mixed with annoyance that junior designer had complained. His emotional state again prevented clear thinking. He couldn't hear his manager's feedback about communication style because his emotions were overriding his ability to process that information rationally. This pattern repeated throughout Mark's career. When someone questioned his technical decisions, emotion hijacked his response, and he became defensive rather than explanatory. When projects encountered problems, emotion hijacked his thinking, and he focused on assigning blame rather than solving problems. So when he received feedback about his communication style, emotion hijacked his processing, and he dismissed the feedback rather than even considering it. Mark's intelligence meant he was capable of sophisticated logical situations, but in the interpersonal relationships where emotional intelligence mattered the most, his emotions consistently hijacked his reasoning. He would leave those interactions believing he had been logical and others had been emotional, never recognizing that he had been the one experiencing that emotional hijacking. So, all in all, Mark lacked self awareness, which is the foundation to emotional intelligence. Self awareness means understanding emotions in real time, recognizing what you're feeling as you're feeling it, and understanding how those emotions are influencing your thinking and your behavior. So, Mark experienced emotions constantly but was rarely aware of them consistently or consciously. So he understood that he was having them, but he didn't really recognize them. When a colleague disagreed with Mark's technical recommendation, he felt his heart rate increase, his jaw tighten. His thoughts were racing towards a defensive argument. And these are clear physiological signals of emotional activation, but Mark wasn't aware of them. He experienced defensiveness without recognizing that he was being defensive himself. From his perspective, he was simply explaining why his approach was correct and the alternative was flawed. His colleague, however, could clearly see that Mark's defensiveness in his body language, tone of voice, and he had an argumentational style. So this mismatch between Mark's internal experience, believing that he was being rational, and his external presentation, which was obviously more on the defensive side, created confusion and distrust. So people stopped taking Mark's technical arguments at face value because they could see the emotional reactions that Mark himself wasn't aware of. That lack of self awareness meant that Mark couldn't regulate his emotions because he didn't consciously recognize them until after they had already influenced his behavior. He'd sometimes realize hours after a difficult conversation that he'd been angry or frustrated, But this delayed awareness came way too late to prevent the emotional reaction from damaging the interaction. Self awareness is a foundational approach because all other emotional intelligence competencies depend on it. You can't manage emotions that you don't recognize. You can't understand others' emotions if you can't understand your own. You cannot make conscious communication choices if you're not aware of how emotions are shaping your automatic reactions. Mark's lack of self awareness meant that despite his intelligence, he remained unable to develop other emotional intelligence skills that would have made him more effective in the collaborative environment. Mark had specific triggers that caused emotional reactions, but because he lacked that self awareness, he never identified these triggers or developed strategies to manage them. So, triggers can cause emotional reactions, and awareness enables control. Without awareness of his triggers, Mark was at the mercy of his automatic emotional responses. One of Mark's primary triggers was being questioned about technical decisions after he had already explained his reasoning. When someone asked him to reconsider an approach or justify a technical choice, Mark felt this as questioning his competence. This trigger activated defensive emotions that immediately influenced his response. He'd become rigid in his thinking, unable to genuinely consider alternative perspectives, and would communicate in ways that shut down further discussion. If Mark had been more aware of this trigger, he could have developed strategies to manage them. He might have recognized the physical sensations associated with the trigger and used them to signal to pause before responding. He might have reframed the questions about his decisions as evidence of engagement rather than challenges to his authority. He might have prepared phrases that allowed him to respond to questions without defensiveness. Another trigger for Mark was a visible inefficiency. When he saw code or processes that he knew could be improved, he felt a strong emotional urge to correct it immediately. And that trigger drove impulsive communication that often damaged relationships. If he'd been aware of the trigger, he could have recognized the difference between inefficiency that needed immediate correction and inefficiency that, while suboptimal, wasn't worth the relational cost of addressing it in a particular moment. Without awareness of his triggers, Mark experienced his emotional reactions as justified responses to external situations. Someone questioning his decisions was objectively wrong to do so. Code that could be improved objectively should be corrected. From his perspective, his reactions were appropriate. What he couldn't see was that the emotional activation that came from his internal triggers rather than the external situation. And that awareness of these triggers would have given him a choice about how to respond. As a result, Mark couldn't practice self management because he lacked the self awareness that makes management possible. Self management means directing emotions productively and delaying short term urges in service of those longer term goals. This requires first recognizing emotions, self awareness, and then making a conscious choice about how to express them or act on those emotional reactions. That's self management. During a client presentation, the client asked a question that Mark felt was addressed clearly in the documentation he had provided. His immediate urge was to say, "I already explained this in the materials I sent you." This urge came from frustration and a touch of superiority. And if Mark had practiced self management, he would have recognized the urge, understood that acting on it would damage the client relationship, and chosen probably a more productive response like, "Let me explain that again in a different way." However, Mark didn't have the self awareness to recognize the urge before acting on it. So he said exactly what his emotional impulse had suggested. The client felt dismissed, the relationship became strained, and the project encountered resistance that could have been avoided. Mark's inability to delay the short term urge to express frustration undermined his longer term goal of successful project completion. Another instance of failed self management occurred during a team conflict. Mark knew intellectually that maintaining positive team relationships was important for a project's success. But when a team member challenged his approach during a meeting, he felt an immediate defensive reaction and responded with sarcasm. His short term urge to defend him over or himself overrode his longer term interest in that team cohesion. Self management would have allowed Mark to feel that the defensive reaction, recognize it, and choose a response aligned with his actual goals rather than his immediate emotional state. He might have said, "That's an interesting concern. Can you help me understand what the specific problem you see with this approach?" This would have directed his emotion productively toward understanding rather than defensiveness while delaying the urge to immediately defend his position. His lack of self management meant his behavior was driven by emotional impulses rather than conscious strategic decisions. His short term emotional reactions consistently undermined his longer term professional goals. But without self awareness and self management skills, he remained trapped in reactive patterns. Mark never assumed favorable intent. When someone made a mistake, questioned his judgment, or failed to follow his instructions, Mark's default assumption was that they were careless, incompetent, or deliberately obstructive. This assumption biased his interpretation of situations and escalated conflicts that could have been avoided. Assuming a favorable intent reduces conflict by creating a space to understand mitigating information before reacting to it. Another colleague named Tom submitted code that broke the overall build on a Friday afternoon. Mark's immediate interpretation was that Tom had been careless and that he hadn't tested his work properly before committing. So he sent a message to the team channel that said, "Someone broke the build right before the weekend. Please test your code before committing." So Tom saw the message, felt attacked, and even though Mark had not named him specifically, the rest of the team knew Tom made the commit and felt the public call out was unnecessarily harsh. What Mark never discovered was that the mitigating information. Tom had tested his code thoroughly in his development environment. The build broke because of an environmental configuration difference that Tom couldn't have predicted without access to the build server logs. If Mark had assumed favorable intent, he would have approached it a whole lot differently. He might have sent Tom a message directly saying, "Hey, the broke build after your the build broke after your commit. Can you take a look?" This would have created space for Tom to explain what happened and basically to discover the configuration issue. Instead, Mark's assumption of carelessness created defensiveness and ultimately resentment. So the pattern repeated constantly. When a junior developer asked what Mark considered a basic question, Mark assumed that they hadn't done the preparation work, rather than considering they might be encountering a conceptual confusion that required explanation. When a client requested a feature that Mark thought was technically misguided, he assumed that they didn't understand their own needs rather than exploring what the problem was that they were actually trying to solve. Assuming favorable intent doesn't necessarily mean being naive about mistakes or incompetence when they genuinely occur. It means starting from a position that others are generally trying to do good work. And that, when things go wrong, there's usually mitigating information worth understanding and exploring. His default assumption of negative intent meant he never sought mitigating information, which meant his interpretations of situations were systematically biased and his responses were systematically more conflictual than necessary. He also struggled profoundly with empathy. Empathy means recognizing others' emotions and understanding their perspectives. Mark could recognize others' emotions in the sense that he could see when someone was upset or frustrated, but he typically interpreted these emotions as character flaws rather than in meaningful information with about their experience. When Sarah became visibly emotional during a meeting about Mark after he had criticized her work, he recognized that she was upset. But his interpretation was that Sarah was just too sensitive or not professional enough to handle direct feedback. He didn't recognize her emotion as signal that his communication style had been harsh or that she was experiencing legitimate distress. His lack of empathy meant he blamed Sarah for emotional responses rather than questioning whether his behavior had contributed to that response that was created. Understanding perspectives was even more difficult for Mark than recognizing emotions. He had he had strong tendency to assume that his perspective was objectively correct and that different perspectives were simply wrong. When a designer advocated for user experience considerations that Mark felt would would complicate technical implementation, Mark couldn't understand why the designer prioritized differently than he did. He saw the designer's perspective was misguided and rather than as a legitimate alternative way of balancing competing priorities. This lack of empathy meant Mark consistently missed information that would have helped him communicate more effectively. If he had tried to understand Sarah's perspective, he would have recognized that she was struggling with confidence in her new role and that his communication style was reinforcing her self doubt. If he had understood the designer's perspective, he would have recognized they were both trying to create good products, but were emphasizing different dimensions of quality. So, empathy isn't about agreeing with others or validating all emotional perspectives, but rather than that, they're they're acknowledging it and recognizing their emotions and perspectives as real and meaningful to them, even when they differ from your own. Mark's inability to practice empathy meant that he operated in a world where only his emotional reality and perspective mattered. This made collaboration extraordinarily difficult because collaboration requires recognizing that others bring different but equally valid experiences and viewpoints to shared work. He believed that he was a good listener because he heard what people said and understood the literal content of their words. Active listening requires much more than just that. Active listening means hearing and understanding in a way that requires full attention to both content and emotional context. Mark rarely practiced active listening because he was usually thinking about his response rather than fully processing what the other person was communicating. During a one on one meeting with his manager, Mark's manager tried to give him feedback about his communication style. She explained that several team members had expressed concerns about feeling dismissed during technical discussions. Mark heard the words his manager was saying, but he was simultaneously formulating his defense rather than truly listening. He was thinking, they're misinterpreting directness as dismissiveness, and I'm just being efficient. Because he wasn't fully attending to his manager's message, he had missed the important nuances. His manager was not saying that Mark was technically wrong in his assessments. She was explaining that his delivery was creating barriers to collaboration. She was trying to help Mark see that his communication style was limiting his effectiveness and that his career progression was in jeopardy. So Mark only heard the criticism that he believed was unjustified. By the end of the conversation, Mark's manager asked him what he took away from their discussion. Mark said, "You want me to be less direct, but I think directness is important for technical work." This response revealed that he had not truly listened. His manager was not asking him to be less direct. She was asking him to be more aware of his directness and how it was landing and to adjust his delivery to match his actual goals. Active listening would have required Mark to set aside his defensive reactions and his predetermined responses. It would have required him to pay closer attention, not just to his manager's words, but to what she was really saying and trying to communicate. It would have required him to reflect back on what he had heard and check his understanding before formulating a response. None of that happened because Mark was not actively listening. He was waiting for his turn to speak while running his own mental monologue about why the feedback was misguided. What we've determined is that he's rarely engaged in any of the 6 components of active listening: paying attention, holding judgment, reflecting, clarifying, summarizing, and sharing. His listening process typically involved hearing enough to formulate his response, then waiting for the other person to stop talking so he could deliver his response. When a junior developer came to Mark with a problem, the developer began explaining the situation. Within 15 seconds, Mark had diagnosed what he believed the problem was. What he interpreted was to provide his solution without letting the developer finish. This violated paying attention. It prevented it because Mark stopped listening once he thought he understood. It violated holding judgment because Mark immediately categorized the situation based on his preconceptions. It violated reflecting, clarifying, and summarizing because Mark never verified his understanding matched what the developer was actually experiencing. If Mark had practiced the components of active listening, the interaction would have gone very different. He would have paid full attention to the developer's complete explanation, including details that might have revised his initial understanding. He would have held judgment about the problem, what it was, until he had heard the full context. He would have been able to reflect back on his understanding by paraphrasing what the developer said. He would have had asked clarifying questions to verify his interpretation. He would have summarized the key points to confirm shared understanding while offering or before offering these solutions. So the sharing component was particularly absent from Mark's listening practice. Sharing means respectfully expressing your own perspective after fully understanding the other person's perspective and recognizing that silence implies agreement, so you have an obligation to voice disagreement if you have it. Now, Mark did express his perspectives, but rarely after fully understanding what the other person's view was. He also violated the principle that silence implies agreement by remaining silent when he disagreed but didn't think the issue was worth arguing about, then later pointing to the lack of objection as justification for his approach. Mark's failure to practice the components of active listening meant his interactions consistently failed to achieve the shared understanding. He gathered enough information to form his own conclusions, but not enough to understand what the others were actually thinking, feeling, or trying to communicate. This is systematic as a failure, and it made genuine collaboration next to impossible. So Mark struggled specifically with paying attention and holding judgment, which are the foundational pieces to all other active listening skills. When someone spoke to Mark, his attention was divided between hearing their words, evaluating their competence, formulating his response, and thinking about other work he needed to complete. This divided his attention, and it meant that he consistently missed important information. When a project manager named Rachel was explaining to Mark why a deadline needed to be moved, she began with the context about the client constraints, moved into details about the team capacity, and was building toward a specific request. Mark heard deadline needs to be moved in the sentence and immediately began thinking about why moving the deadline could create problems. His attention shifted from Rachel's explanation to his own mental analysis. By the time Rachel finished speaking, Mark had missed half of what she said. He also failed to hold judgment, which means creating psychological safety and adopting a learner mindset rather than immediately categorizing or evaluating what you hear. When Rachel mentioned that the team capacity was a factor in the deadline issue, Mark immediately judged this as poor resource planning. This judgment colored his interpretation of everything that followed. Instead of listening to understand what Rachel's complete reasoning was, he was filtering everything through his predetermined conclusion that the project was poorly managed. So, if he had truly paid full attention, he would have heard that Rachel was actually proposing a strategic resequencing of deliverables that would have been a better match for the client priorities while maintaining the overall timeline. She wasn't asking to extend the project. She was proposing to optimize the delivery schedule, but Mark's divided attention and premature judgment meant he never understood what Rachel was actually proposing. So his response to Rachel was based on what he thought she was saying rather than what she had actually said. He began explaining why the deadline extensions were unacceptable and why proper planning would have avoided this situation. Rachel realized Mark had not listened to her proposal at all, became frustrated, and stopped trying to collaborate with him on the project planning. This cycle repeated through Mark's career, making collaboration increasingly difficult as people learned that Mark truly didn't listen. So he operated almost exclusively on a judger mindset. Learners welcome difference and see alternative perspectives as opportunities to expand understanding. Judgers shut down dialogue by categorizing information as right or wrong based on whether it aligns with their existing views. Mark's judger mindset meant he approached every interaction by evaluating whether others were correct according to his standards rather than trying to learn from their different perspectives. So during a discussion about project architecture, a colleague named Mike suggested an approach that differed from what Mark had proposed. Mark's immediate internal response was to judge Mike's suggestion as inferior. He thought that approach has obvious drawbacks and that Mike was not listening. The judger mindset prevented Mark from genuinely considering whether Mike's perspective might offer insights that Mark was missing. So, a learner mindset would have generated different internal questions. Instead of what's wrong with this suggestion, Mark would have asked, what problem is Mike trying to solve that I might not be considering? Instead of why is Mike not seeing the obvious drawbacks, he would have asked, what advantages is Mike seeing that are not immediately obvious to me? These questions create openness to learning rather than closure through the judgment. Mark's judger mindset was very visible in his language. He used phrases like "that will not work" rather than "help me understand how that would address the reliability concerns." He said the right way to do this rather than one effective approach might be. And he framed disagreement as error rather than as different perspective. And this mindset shut down dialogue repeatedly. So when people offered ideas to Mark, immediately he judged them as wrong. People stopped offering ideas. When people expressed concerns and Mark judged those concerns as misguided, people stopped expressing concerns. The judger mindset created conditions where Mark only received information that aligned with his existing views, which meant he became increasingly isolated from the diverse perspectives that could have actually improved his work. The tragedy is that Mark believed his judger mindset was a strength. He saw it as maintaining high standards rather than recognizing it as being limiting to his learning and his growth. A learner mindset doesn't mean accepting all ideas as equally valid. It means remaining open to learning more from different perspectives, even when you're ultimately disagreeing with them. So, Mark rarely practiced reflecting, clarifying, or summarizing in any conversation. These three components of active listening serve to verify shared understanding and give the other person opportunity to correct misinterpretations. Mark basically assumed his understanding was accurate and proceeded based on the assumption without verification. Reflecting means paraphrasing what you've heard to check whether your interpretation matches the speaker's intent. When a team member explained a problem they were experiencing, Mark never said, "So, what I'm hearing is," or "let me make sure that I understand this correctly." He simply began responding based on his interpretation without confirming that interpretation was even accurate. A developer named Alex tried to explain a complex timing issue in the system. Alex spent several minutes describing the problem, including the details about when it occurred and what seemed to trigger it. Mark listened, partially, and formed an interpretation that this was a caching issue. Without reflecting back on his understanding, Mark immediately began explaining how to adjust the cache and through the invalidation logic. Alex tried to interpret this to clarify that caching was not the issue, but Mark was already deep into his explanation. Eventually, Alex gave up trying to correct Mark's misunderstanding and simply thanked him for the advice. Mark walked away believing that he had solved the problem. Alex walked away knowing the real issue was unaddressed. If Mark had reflected his understanding back to Alex before offering solutions, Alex could have corrected the misinterpretation immediately. Clarifying questions serve similar verification purposes. When something is ambiguous, asking a clarifying question prevents that misunderstanding from compounding. Mark rarely asked clarifying questions because he believed he understood quickly and accurately. This confidence prevented him from recognizing when his understanding was actually incomplete or incorrect. Summarizing key points at the end of the conversation creates a final checkpoint for shared understanding. Mark never summarized because he saw it as redundant. If the conversation already happened, why restate what was happening or what was said? He missed that summarizing serves to align interpretations, not just to repeat information. Without summarizing, Mark and his colleagues rarely left conversations believing they had agreed on things they actually understood differently. Mark misunderstood the sharing component of communication. He believed sharing meant expressing his opinion, which he did frequently and directly. What he missed was that sharing must occur within dialogue, which means respectful expression that creates space for exchange rather than monologue. Mark also violated the principle that silence implies agreement, using his silence strategically in ways that created confusion and conflict. So during team meetings, Mark would sometimes remain silent when proposals were presented that he disagreed with, but didn't think they were worth fighting for in the moment. Other team members interpreted his silence as agreement or at least acquiescence. They moved forward with the decisions, believing that their team had consensus. Later, when problems emerged, Mark would say, "I knew this approach wouldn't work," or "I never agreed with this decision." His colleagues were frustrated and confused. They pointed out that Mark had been silent through the decision discussion. Mark's response was that his silence didn't mean agreement. It meant he didn't feel like arguing. But in a group decision making, silence functionally implies agreement. If you disagree meaningfully with a direction, respectful expression of that disagreement is an obligation. It's not an option. Mark's expression when he did share his views often failed to create space for dialogue. He would state his position firmly and then defend it against all challenges rather than exploring different perspectives. When someone disagreed with him, Marx saw this as conflict to be won rather than dialogue to be developed. True sharing in dialogue means expressing your opinions and perspectives while remaining genuinely open to being influenced by others' perspectives. It means presenting your reasoning clearly enough that others can understand and engage with it. It means respecting the other's rights to disagree and treating disagreement as valuable rather than as opposition. Mark's communication style included expression, but excluded the mutual respect and openness that transformation of that expression was moved into dialogue. The result was that Mark sharing often shut down discussion rather than opening it up. People learned that once Mark stated his position, there was little point in continued discussion. This made meetings less productive and prevented the team from benefiting from genuine dialogue where multiple perspectives could interact and create a genuinely better solution than an individual one would reach alone. So he experienced all three primary barriers to effective listening constantly: time pressure, defensiveness, judging. These barriers prevented him from engaging in the kind of deep listening that would have made his communication far more effective. Time pressure was Mark's most frequently cited excuse for not listening carefully. He was always busy, always had multiple urgent tasks, and always felt that spending time to fully understanding someone's perspectives was simply inefficient. When a colleague wanted to explain their reasoning for a technical decision, Mark would interrupt after about 30 seconds, saying he understood and needed to move on. His focus on efficiency meant he consistently underinvested in the understanding that would have made his subsequent work far more effective. Now, defensiveness was Mark's automatic response to anything that could have been interpreted as criticism or disagreement. When his manager tried to give him feedback about communication style, Mark immediately became defensive. Instead of listening to understand what patterns his manager was identifying, Mark listened to prepare his counter arguments. His defensiveness created a barrier that prevented him from hearing feedback that could have helped him grow. Judging others' competence, motivations, and perspectives created that third barrier. Mark entered most conversations having already judged the other person's likely level of understanding or value of their input. When a junior developer asked to discuss an approach, Mark had already judged that developer probably didn't understand the constraints well enough to propose something useful. This prejudgment meant Mark didn't listen with genuine openness to what the developer might actually contribute. And these barriers interacted and reinforced each other. Time pressure made Mark more prone to defensiveness because he felt interrupted from important work. Defensiveness led to judging because Mark protected himself by categorizing others' input as wrong or misguided. Judging created time pressure because Mark felt that he needed to correct misunderstandings rather than learning from a different perspective. So he could have overcome these barriers with a conscious effort. He could have scheduled dedicated time for important conversations, removing time pressure. He could have practiced recognizing his defensive reactions and pausing before responding. He could have consciously suspended judgment and approached conversations with genuine curiosity. But none of this happened because Mark didn't recognize these barriers as problems with his own listening. He believed the problems were with others and who were not clear enough, were too sensitive, or didn't understand issues well enough. So he asked many questions, but they were rarely the right questions. His questions tended to be testing questions that assessed whether the other person knew what Mark thought they should know, rather than questions that supported learning and engaged and encouraged expression of different perspectives. When a team member presented an approach to Mark for review, Mark's questions were: did you consider the performance implications? Have you looked at how the authentication system will integrate with this? These questions assumed deficiency. They suggested that Mark expected these considerations had been overlooked and was checking to confirm his suspicion. So, questions that support learning and encourage perspectives would have sounded very much different. Mark could have said, what performance characteristics are you targeting, and how does this approach achieve them? Walk me through how you're thinking about the authentication integration. These questions assume competence and invite the explanation rather than starting from an assumption of incomplete or incompetent thinking. So his testing questions created a dynamic where team members felt interrogated rather than supported. They became defensive because they correctly perceived that Mark was checking for mistakes rather than seeking to understand their reasoning. And this defensiveness interfered with clear communication and made the entire interaction less productive. Right questions open up exploration rather than narrowing down to predetermined answers. They communicate respect for others rather than, and they create this space for learning in both directions where the question asker might discover perspectives they had not considered. Mark's questions served primarily to demonstrate his own knowledge and to identify gaps in others' thinking, which meant they functioned as barriers to communication rather than as tools for understanding. And if Mark had learned to ask the right questions, his interactions would have been made um, far, far, far more of an impact, and they would have transformed. Instead of making others defensive, he would have made them feel valued for their thinking. Instead of confirming his own predetermined conclusions, he would have gained access to diverse perspectives that could have interpreted his own work. Instead of being seen as interrogating, he would have been seen as collaborating. But this would have required fundamental changes in how Mark approached conversations, moving from that judging to the learning mindset. So he never used a rapport building questions, rarely used funnel questions appropriately. He used never used probing questions, but used them as interrogation rather than as exploration, and almost never asked solution oriented questions that invited collaboration. His questioning style consistently reinforced separation rather than building those connections. So rapport building questions establish the relationship and psychological safety before diving into the content. Questions like, how is the project going for you? What is the most interesting thing about this work? These signal interest in the person and their experience, not just extracting information. Mark never asked these questions. He moved directly to technical content, which meant his interactions felt transactional rather than that relational aspect. Funnel questions start broad and progressively narrow their focus based on what's learned. So Mark occasionally used this structure, but he typically started with his predetermined narrow focus rather than genuinely beginning broadly. So when reviewing someone's work, an effective funnel sequence might start with, tell me about your overall approach. then narrow it to how did you decide on this particular implementation? And then focus on what led you to use this specific pattern. Mark would skip directly to questioning about the specific pattern, missing the broader context that would have helped him understand that reasoning. Probing questions should deepen the understanding by exploring reasoning, assumptions, and alternatives. Mark's probing questions were almost always challenging rather than exploring. He would ask, "Why did you do it that way?" in a tone that communicated judgment rather than curiosity. Even when his intent was to understand, his delivery made probing questions feel like attacks, which created defensiveness that interfered with the exploration he was supposedly seeking. So, solution oriented questions invite collaboration by asking others to contribute to problem solving. Questions like, what approaches do you think could address this constraint? Or, if you were designing this differently, what would you consider? Mark rarely asked those questions because he typically already knew what the solution was that he thought was correct. His questions were more about leading others to predetermined answers than genuinely exploring possibilities collaboratively. The absence of these question types in Mark's communication meant his interactions consistently missed opportunities to build relationships, understand context, explore reasoning, and develop collaborative solutions. His questions function primarily to assert his own knowledge and identify others' deficiencies rather than to generate shared understanding and that collective intelligence. He paid almost no attention to nonverbal communication. It was frustrating. Despite the fact that 60 to 80% of meaning is conveyed through nonverbal channels, he focused entirely on verbal content and missed the subconscious signals that were actually driving most of the meaning in his interactions. During a presentation to stakeholders, Mark noticed that several of the people had their arms crossed. He interpreted this as disrespect or a lack of interest. His verbal response was to add even more technical detail, like I was mentioning earlier, trying to recapture their attention through a more thorough explanation. What he missed was the nonverbal signals indicated that cognitive overload was there and a lack of comprehension, not of disinterest. The stakeholders were disengaging because they couldn't follow his level of technical detail, not because they didn't care about the project. So his own nonverbal communication was equally problematic, though he was completely unaware of it. When someone said something that he disagreed with, Mark would interrupt, lean forward aggressively, and raise his voice slightly. These nonverbal signals communicated hostility, even when his verbal message was ostensibly rational. His colleagues decoded the nonverbal channel, aggression and dismissal, more strongly than the verbal channel, the technical disagreement, which is why they experienced his communication as attacking, even when his words weren't explicitly hostile. Mark frequently crossed his arms during conversations, which created a closed, defensive posture. He made intense eye contact that others experienced as intimidating rather than engaging. He would shake his head slightly while others were speaking if he disagreed with what they were saying, which communicated judgment before they had even finished. All of these nonverbal signals interfered with communication, but Mark was completely unconscious of them. This mismatch between what Mark said and how he said it created a constant confusion and mistrust. When Mark had told someone, I'm open to alternative approaches, his verbal communication communicated openness. But his nonverbal communication conveyed, like through his crossed arms, dismissive tone, impatient body language, communicated the opposite. People trusted the nonverbal channel because those channels are harder to fake, which meant they didn't believe Mark was actually open to any discussions, even though he said it. And his blindness to nonverbal communication meant that he was missing the majority of what was actually being communicated in his own interactions. He was also sending nonverbal messages that he didn't intend and was completely unaware of, which consistently undermined his conscious communication goals. So he never worked on building rapport through that nonverbal communication. Building a rapport nonverbally means synchronizing body language and reading cues in context to create connection and understanding. His body language was consistently closed and it was aggressive, and he rarely read others' nonverbal cues accurately. When meeting with a nervous junior employee who was presenting work for review, the employee's body language signaled anxiety. She was speaking quietly, fidgeting with papers, avoiding eye contact, and had a tense posture. Mark completely missed these signals. He proceeded with his normal direct questioning style, asking her to justify her decisions and pointing out problems with her approach. And his failure to read her nonverbal cues and adapt to his communication made her anxiety even worse, which made the entire interaction less productive. If Mark had been aware of building rapport nonverbally, he would have noticed the anxiety signals and adjusted his own nonverbal communication to be more reassuring. He might have adopted a more relaxed posture himself, used a calmer tone of voice, made his eye contact less intense, and allowed more pauses in the conversation. These nonverbal adjustments would have helped the junior employee relax, which would have enabled more productive discussion of her work. Synchronizing body language doesn't necessarily mean mimicking the other person exactly. It means matching the energy levels, openness, and engagement appropriately. When meeting with enthusiastic stakeholders who are excited about a project, Mark's flat effect and minimal nonverbal response made him seem disengaged or unenthusiastic. The stakeholder left the meeting believing that Mark was not committed to the project, which actually Mark was very excited about, but he just simply didn't express it through his nonverbal actions. Reading the cues in context means understanding that the same nonverbal signal can mean different things depending on circumstances. Someone crossing their arms might be cold, might be comfortable that in that position, might be defensive. Context helps disambiguate. Mark never looked for context. He interpreted crossed arms as always defensive, lack of eye contact as always indicating dishonesty, and fidgeting as always indicating nervousness or incompetence. These rigid interpretations meant he consistently misread what others were actually communicating. Mark's inability to build the rapport nonverbally meant he started every interaction at a disadvantage. While others were unconsciously building connection through synchronization and responsive body language, he was unconsciously creating distance and discomfort. His technical communication became harder to hear because his nonverbal channel was communicating disconnection. So as a result, he failed completely at relationship management. Relationship management means adapting communication styles to different people and situations while maintaining civility, even in difficult interactions. Mark communicated essentially the same way, regardless of whether he was talking to his manager, a junior employee, a client, or a peer, and regardless of whether the situation was routine or and high stakes. His manager needed strategic context and business justification when Mark proposed technical approaches. Mark gave her dense technical detail with minimal business framing. His junior employees needed encouragement and patient explanation when they encountered problems. Mark gave them curt corrections and assumptions of incompetence. His clients needed to understand how technical decisions served their business goals. Mark gave them technical rationale that assumed that they'd already understood the architectural principles. This failure to adapt meant Mark was consistently ineffective across different relationships. His manager became frustrated that she couldn't understand his proposals well enough to advocate for them to the senior leadership team. His junior employees avoided asking him for help, which slowed their development and created knowledge silos. His clients felt that he wasn't listening to their needs, which damaged relationships and created project friction. Mark also failed to maintain civility in difficult interactions. When conflicts arose or when he disagreed strongly with others, Mark would become dismissive or openly contemptuous. He would say things like, "That is the worst idea I've heard all week." Or, "I can't believe we're even discussing this." These failures of civility burned bridges that could never be fully repaired. Relationship management requires recognizing that different relationships have different dynamics and different communication needs. So it requires maintaining basic respect and civility even when you're frustrated or in strong disagreement. It requires seeing communication as serving relationships, not just as transmitting information. Mark never developed these capabilities because he believed technical correctness was more important than relational considerations. So, the cumulative effect of Mark's failed relationship management was professional isolation. People worked with him when they had no choice, but avoided him when they could. He was excluded from important decisions, not because his technical insights were not valuable, but because his relationship management failures made including him more costly than valuable in his contributions. So, all in all, the fundamental takeaway from Mark's story is that emotional intelligence strengthens communication and listening drives success. Mark's technical brilliance was real. His intelligence was never in question. What limited his effectiveness and eventually derailed his career was his lack of emotional intelligence and his fundamental inability to listen. Emotional intelligence strengthens communication by creating the conditions where technical expertise can actually be deployed effectively. Mark knew how to solve complex technical problems, but he couldn't communicate solutions in ways that others could hear, understand, or worse, implement. He could identify risks early, but he communicated warnings in ways that made people dismiss them. He had knowledge, but he transferred that knowledge poorly because he couldn't adapt his communication to his audience's learning needs. Listening drives success because all meaningful work happens through collaboration, and collaboration requires understanding of what the others think, feel, need, and most importantly, know. Mark's failure to listen meant he operated in isolation even when he was physically present in a team. He made decisions without understanding important context. He proposed solutions that didn't address real problems. He created conflict where collaboration could have helped and happened. All of this stemmed from his inability to listen in ways that created shared understanding. If Mark had developed emotional intelligence and listening skills, his career trajectory would have been completely different. His technical expertise would have been amplified rather than isolated. His early warnings would have been heeded rather than dismissed. His knowledge would have been transferred effectively to others. His relationships would have been collaborative rather than conflictual. His career would have progressed rather than stalled. So, the tragedy of Mark's story is that none of this required him to be less technically capable. Emotional intelligence and listening don't replace technical competence. They enable technical competence to achieve its potential impact. Mark could have remained exactly as smart as he was while becoming vastly more effective if he had just developed those communication capabilities. So, as you move into your own professional practices, remember that your technical skills are necessary, but not sufficient. The differentiator between those who succeed and those who struggle is not technical capability. It's the emotional intelligence and the ability to listen in ways that create shared understanding, build relationships, and enable collaboration. These are the skills that you can develop deliberately, and developing them will determine whether your technical capabilities create the impact that you intend.